In 2015, a then record-breaking El Niño occurred that caused significant impacts across the world. Record-breaking heat waves were recorded across much of the United States, Europe, and other parts of the world. And in the Atlantic, the hurricane season, with the exception of Hurricane Joaquin, was relatively quiet. What it also did was significantly enhance the winter weather across much of the eastern United States. An infamous example of this was from January 22nd to 24th, 2016, with the Snowzilla blizzard that impacted DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. This winter storm impacted tens of millions of people, including two of my closest friends, who actually helped me make a documentary on the blizzard 2.5 years ago. However, as we go back to the present, what we are looking at for 2026 is a significant Super El Nino developing in the same region, and the impacts on our winter could be just as extreme as the water temperature anomalies that are being registered. In this video, we're going to be going over how this Super El Nino could greatly impact our winter weather in the first part of our winter weather series. Alright, let's dive into this. So we have our developing Super El Nino that's going on across much of the ENSO region, and we're going to be discussing that a little bit, as well as its impacts on the winter weather that we're seeing based on the early climate models, and kind of giving an idea from an El Nino perspective what we might expect and how things might pan out, as well as using some past analogs to kind of back that up. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and first talk about the Super El Nino, give a quick update on that. Then we're going to pivot right into the models and talk about our winter weather scenarios. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and dive right into this. So starting off, quick update on this. This is our region 1 and 2, which is off the coast of Peru over here in South America. What you're seeing right here is a continued increase. You've kind of seen a little bit of stagnation over the last couple of weeks or so in this part, looking at around 3.8 degrees Celsius. That is a pretty extreme water temperature anomaly going on over here. It's kind of been hovering over there, which has never really happened before in that area, and that's pretty concerning to say the very least. Looking at regions 3 and 4, you had a bit of a spike yesterday, but it's dipped a little bit down to around 2.29 degrees Celsius above average. So we're firmly in El Nino territory right here, ladies and gentlemen. And that is going to be very interesting for exactly how this is going to pan out, because this El Nino is forecast to only continue to get stronger and stronger. In fact, some of the models were forecasting some temperature anomalies exceeding 5 degrees Celsius by the time we got to around November and December. And we're going to go ahead and show you those in just a second. So let's go ahead and go to our world view. Let's go ahead and show you what we have for our water temperature anomalies. This is what we have going on right here in this ENSO region. We're going to talk about this first, and then we're going to go ahead and get to the United States. So here's our El Nino that's currently developing, expected to continue to get stronger and stronger as we get towards September, October. And then things start to get a little interesting depending on each model. Starting around November, you do start to see a little bit of stagnation. Yes, the El Nino does extend the furthest out to the west, but your water temperature anomalies aren't exactly getting any hotter. They are somewhat maxed out according to the CANSIPs, but in regions 1 and 2, and you start seeing how things start to get a little bit too stretched out over here. And by the time we get to December, you do start to see this El Nino retreating a bit further to the east, while still remaining very strong. It seems to me, at least according to the CANSIPs, that it does peak around October or so before starting to stagnate, and then January is when you start seeing a little bit more of that decline. Same thing with February, then going into March and April, and so on and so forth. That's the CANSIPs. What's the CFS forecasting with this right here? The CFS is pretty much forecasting something even stronger to happen by the time we get to November 2026. They're forecasting a peak to happen around this time, October or in November. One of those 2 months It is forecast to peak in terms of intensity in both regions 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So we're going to want to watch out for this. And this is also perfect timing for winter weather as well. As we get into December, you're looking at your CFS, it starts to weaken a little bit. And then going into January and February, it continues to weaken further as you start seeing those cooler anomalies starting to punch through a bit further down the line, a bit deeper into the thermocline. And then going into March and April, it continues to decline from that point as well. So overall, regardless of the exact intensity, you're still looking at a super strong El Nino that we're going to be dealing with throughout the winter of 2026 going into 2027. So the main question now is, how exactly is this going to impact our winter weather, and what should we be watching out for? Well, for starters, let's go ahead and move to the continental United States, and we'll go ahead and pull a few things up because I want to start with our main sea level pressure anomalies right here. We'll show you the CFS, and then we'll take a look at it from a climatological perspective, and then show some other models that are going to forecast this. So we're going to go ahead and start for October 2026. What you're noticing here is your classic shift where the West Coast sees lower pressure than average. You start seeing the East Coast, particularly around the Deep South, getting lower pressure than average, whereas areas around the Great Plains is about higher pressure than average. What this indicates is potentially more stormy weather. Lower pressure equals more storms generally, and what you're seeing here is more stormy potential across much of the West Coast, particularly around California, as the Pineapple Express starts to get its act together starting around November of 2026. And you're also noticing a lot more storm activity possible across much of the eastern half of the United States, particularly concentrated in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and a few other states as well. What this indicates also is the return of severe weather season in the Deep South. And these anomalies right here kind of indicate that, okay, looks like to me that at least with the lower pressure that we're seeing, we might see some more intense severe weather activity as a result. I'll also check the moisture component as well to kind of vet that information as well. This is kind of starting off as your classic El Nino setup right here. Not as much convection and not as much storm activity possible in parts of the Great Plains, more so in the eastern half of the United States and on the west coast of the US as well, going into Arizona and New Mexico as well. Looking at the CANSIPS is a little bit different, I would say. It mainly keeps the high pressure in much of the northern part of the United States, going from parts of the Great Plains and New England. It mainly remains relatively weaker than it is relatively weaker in terms of intensity compared to the CFS, but you are seeing those lower pressure anomalies across the southern 70% of the United States, from Washington all the way down to Florida, until it starts to kind of get toward that higher pressure anomaly as you get towards the Florida Keys over here. So a general disagreement with what we're seeing in terms of not necessarily the pressures and all that, but in terms of where at least it'll initially start. And going forward, one of the models is forecasting New England to be under lower pressure, one of them a bit higher. But overall, it's a similar setup with the exception of this lower pressure anomaly moving deeper into the Great Plains. That's kind of a bit of a shift that we're noticing, and small shifts like that definitely could play a role into what may be going on. And also, it's just a situation that we're going to want to watch and see how this will progress, especially as the new model runs start to come in as we head towards August. So here's the CFS precip anomalies that we have going on right here. Pretty interesting setup that we got across much of the United States. Kind of what I was suspecting over here, with the East Coast getting those higher precip anomalies on top of those lower pressure anomalies as well. Potentially going to enhance your severe weather season when that starts ramping up in that part of the country as well. But it also expands all the way from New England all the way to the Four Corners over here, and in California it remains relatively dry in the northern part of the US, although things start to moisten up slightly across parts of Southern California as the Pineapple Express starts to slowly make its way over there. And as time continues to go on, things get a little interesting across parts of the United States where you have more moisture in parts of the Great Plains than average, potentially a little bit more rain, over there as well. Remains relatively dry across parts of the northern United States as well, particularly around the Great Lakes region, which is kind of interesting, albeit not necessarily unexpected in an El Nino region. In terms of the context of what you'd see in a classic El Nino, this is about what you would expect, with the exception of this moisture over here in this part of the Great Plains, which I do find kind of curious, and we're going to want to watch and see how this will evolve. Looking at the CANSIPs, it's a bit of a similar story, as a matter of fact, where you're looking at more moisture across much of the eastern half of the United States, with the exception of Florida to start, potentially going to enhance your severe weather season down here, but more so in the Great Plains than what you would originally see. So that's kind of an interesting situation. The mountains in this scenario remain relatively quiet to start. That's to be expected. Those don't start seeing a lot of snowfall until later down the line, particularly November, December, mainly coming from the Pineapple Express in California when that starts to come in the next month. And going into November, things start to get a little interesting. The moisture remains a bit more concentrated across much of the eastern US over here. California and the west coast of the US, not necessarily seeing too much. In fact, in the Pacific Northwest, you're seeing a drier anomaly than what's forecast. That's pretty typical in an El Nino setup right here. So you're going to want to pay attention to that and see how this will pan out. Seeing a couple of slightly more moist than average anomalies in parts of the Great Plains, which I do find kind of curious, but overall, this is going to enhance your severe weather season, and potentially when nor'easters start ramping up, say in mid to late November, this is definitely going to be a bit of a concern, especially if you're in New England areas in the northeastern United States, because in El Nino years, you have a situation where a lot of the rain-snow line, I know that's a big topic for you guys over there, it looks to me that the rain-snow line is going to be a bit further out to sea and potentially get more snowfall for a lot of these areas, particularly along the eastern coast of the United States. That's typically what's to expect, and it's definitely something that we're going to want to watch out for. Looking at the CFS monthly, things are a little bit different. For starters, instead of drier than average, you're looking at more moist than average, which is definitely a huge disagreement over here. And this is kind of what we don't see typically with an El Nino. In terms of what we're seeing over here in California, the Pineapple Express starts ramping up around this time over here, so that's not necessarily too surprising, but you're seeing a lot more moisture in the deep south than the average, mainly because of the fact that it's an El Nino, severe weather season's going to especially start ramping up. And this is also kind of a typical pattern over here. Same thing over here with the northern Midwest being drier than average, primarily driven by El Nino. That's going to mean potentially less lake effect snow if you're in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. So that's definitely an interesting situation that we have going on, but a bit of a disagreement in terms of your moisture going into November of 2026. And I want to cross-check this with our temperatures, as a matter of fact. So let's go ahead and do that. Looking at our temperatures across much of the United States, remains much warmer than average, and especially around the areas in the Great Plains. In parts of New England, it's a bit split. In parts of the Deep South, it's a bit split. If you're in Texas, you're at or slightly below average. If you're in other parts of the South, it's slightly above average. Definitely some interesting stuff. What I would say with this is it's not exactly what you would typically see with an El Nino, at least this early out. What you typically see is more cold across parts of New England, more cold across parts of the Deep South over here, but that does start to develop down the line. So I'm not necessarily too worried about that. So we'll have to keep an eye on it. Just something to pay attention to down the line. Just to cross-check this with the CANSIPs real quickly. It's a bit different, as a matter of fact. In fact, you have much warmer anomalies along the west coast over here and more warm anomalies across much of the east coast over here compared to the average, whereas kind of the Midwest and the Great Plains kind of slices the country in half with average or below average outside of areas like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan over here. So we'll have to pay attention to it. We'll have to watch out for it, but overall a bit different from what you would see from a classic El Nino setup. And checking the NMME right here, mainly broadly warmer than average over here for November 2026. So that's something that we'll continue to keep an eye on and we'll pay attention to as well. But shifting over once again to our main sea level pressure anomalies, we're going to start getting deeper into the season. We're going to go ahead and go towards December and then January and then February. So looking at December of 2026, considerably lower pressure than average, especially along the west coast of the United States, especially in the deep south over here, and it's really starting to creep in into parts of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and other parts of the mid-Atlantic. So we're going to want to watch out for it. That's going to potentially be some more stormy weather. That's potentially going to be your nor'easters really starting to ramp up and head over there. And as time continues to progress, as we get to January, according to the CFS, still quite aggressive for right here. Things are pretty interesting, and things are really ramping up. You're looking at minus 4.5 millibars below average right here. For those of you who do not know how much of an anomaly that is, just an idiom here. Instead of maybe 1,005 millibar tropical storm, you have 1,000 millibar tropical storm to deal with instead. And I know this doesn't compare to mid-latitude cyclones and all that, but the easiest comparison I can say is compare that from maybe a weak to mid tropical storm to more of a strong tropical storm situation. And same thing with nor'easters, and same thing with mid-latitude cyclones. Compare that to maybe a weak and moderate mid-latitude cyclone to potentially a lot stronger of a mid-latitude cyclone that you're dealing with now. That's how impressive these anomalies are. And it's not just here, it's also in the mountains, it's also on the west coast, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, California, and the mountain regions over here, as I mentioned earlier. That's potentially going to increase your snow total, especially along the northern parts of the mountain ranges, in the upper elevations, and in the peaks. So that's something we're watching out for. And then going into February, a lot of this low pressure anomalies just shift over to the east coast of the United States. And you're seeing slightly higher pressures in parts of the Great Plains. Compare that to January, where pretty much everyone is in lower pressures. We're a situation where everyone could see a lot more stormy weather than what we would originally expect, at least according to the CFS right here. February starts to see that shift, and then as we get to March, you're still seeing that pressure really below average across much of the eastern United States. Still potentially some more late season nor'easters over here that we're going to want to pay attention to, and if it's cold enough, it could definitely produce some late season snowfall over there, but that's just the CFS. And the CANCIPS isn't as cut and dry. Going into December 2026, it's a lot more split. With this, it's kind of showing lower pressure anomalies across parts of the southern Midwest, deep south, and parts of Florida and California as the Pineapple Express ramps up over there. And then as we get into January, you're starting to see those decrease in pressures along the west coast over here, remaining rather stagnant over here in the eastern part of the United States. But going into February, according to the CANCIPS, definitely starts to change. It's not as aggressive as the CFS is showing, and the CANCIPS is actually a bit later on its timing compared to what we've seen with the CFS. But compared to an El Nino, based on both of these models compared to the El Nino that we are seeing right here, it's definitely an intriguing situation. The CFS with the Super El Nino that's going on is going extremely aggressive, whereas the CANCIPS is actually rather conservative. So at this point, I'm looking at this and I'm going, okay, we're going to need to have to meet somewhere in the middle to kind of give an idea as to what's going on. But in terms of what's going on with Super El Nino, at least along the East Coast, it seems to me that the CFS forecast that we're seeing is kind of generally more in agreement. Not necessarily in terms of the Midwest, that's generally more of a milder winter you get in an El Nino year, but because this is a Super El Nino and this is going to potentially disrupt the jet that we're dealing with, it's going to be an intriguing situation that we're going to want to watch for. And I want to check the temperature anomalies as well between this and the CFS. The CANCIPS over here, at least from what we see for the July models, forecasting colder than average anomalies in the Midwest and in parts of the Deep South and in parts of New England and parts of the Mid-Atlantic over here. But it's mainly concentrated in the Midwest, which is actually very atypical compared to what we see on a classic El Nino setup, as a matter of fact. So overall, this Super El Nino, at least according to the CANCIPS, could actually disrupt the flow enough to kind of have a reverse situation where the temperatures on the west coast are warmer than average and in temperatures in the Midwest are actually colder than average. That's definitely a situation that we're going to want to watch for as this El Nino peaks. But compare that to the CFS. This is February 2027 on the CFS, where it seems to me that according to the CFS, it's more aggressive and it's kind of a mix of everywhere with the exception of these areas. Instead of being colder than average, it's warmer than average. So there's generally some disagreement over here. And this is kind of more what you would typically expect, mainly the colder anomalies to be concentrated in the deep south and in parts of the mid-Atlantic and New England over here as well. So that's kind of a situation that we're paying attention to and something that we're going to want to watch down the line. But checking the NMME for context and comparison, NMME for January kind of remaining above average or average across parts of the southern part of the US, and then February it finally creeps into those colder averages right here. NMME doesn't have the grid spacing the CFS and the CANSIPS has, so it's not as detailed, but things are definitely getting interesting over here. There is generally some disagreement between the models, but at least compared to what we would typically see in an El Nino, some of them aren't that far off. The CANSIPS is definitely in a big disagreement compared to the CFS and the NMME. They want it to be colder across parts of the Midwest, where the other two want it colder across parts of the Deep South and the Mid-Atlantic, at least. So it's definitely an intriguing winter that we're kind of being set up for as well. But what I will say, and there's something that these models are not disputing, is if you're tuning in from the East Coast, you're going to want to pay attention to potentially more nor'easters, potentially a more extreme winter, as typical for an El Nino year. We saw this in 1993, we saw this in 2003, we saw this in 2010 with Snowmageddon, we saw this in 2016 with Snowzilla. So overall, it's definitely a situation that we're going to need to watch out for. But I also want to go ahead and check what our moisture is going to be looking like, at least later into the winter, according to the NMME, since we can provide that. Generally more of an El Nino favored setup right here. Florida, according to all three models, definitely sees a lot more convection, definitely sees a lot more severe weather, whether it's mesoscale or developed by a lot of mid-latitude cyclones, but you're seeing a lot more rain and a lot more convection potential in that part of the country, particularly in areas like Georgia and South Carolina. And in California, the Pineapple Express is in full swing over here, and it starts to bleed into some of the mountains, particularly the Sierra Nevadas and parts of the Rocky Mountains in Utah, Colorado, and in some parts of Oregon and Arizona as well. So definitely stuff that we're going to want to watch out for. But the NMME, at least according to what we're seeing based on the precip alone, definitely more of an El Nino favorite setup later into the season. Looking at the CFS, generally more so in agreement as well. Same thing with January and February, kind of drier than average in the Midwest, moister than average along the coast with the exception of Washington over here, and in the East Coast as well. So definitely something to pay attention to for sure. And looking at those temperature anomalies as well, definitely going to be more favorable for some nor'easters to really ramp up, and especially along the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic. They could see a potentially brutal winter this year based on all the climatology and based on a lot of the climatological models I am already seeing. So that's something we're going to want to watch, looking at the CANSIPS as well. General agreement along all three of these, at least late in the season. So what I can diagnose here is a few things. Number one, the models are very much in disagreement early in the season, but they start to get better and better and more aligned as we get towards January and February of 2027, with more so of an El Nino favored situation going on as we get later into the season. But early on is a bit of a wild card, and it's kind of all over the place, and these models are going to need to kind of continue to run, kind of get their act together, and come to some sort of consensus in the next couple of months. That's the first thing I can say. The second thing I will say is, if you're tuning in from the West Coast, the Pineapple Express could potentially be pretty strong this year based on the moisture anomalies and the pressure anomalies that we're seeing, so you're going to want to pay attention to it, especially if you're in California. The good news to that is that'll be your rainy season. You're not going to see as many wildfires, but potentially pretty big flash flooding could be a result from that, and you're going to want to pay attention to it. And if you're tuning in from the East Coast, first of all, if you're in the Deep South, I would expect more severe weather, and that's kind of what an El Nino typically would favor. But if you're along the East Coast, particularly the Mid-Atlantic and New England, I would see more nor'easters, I would see more winter storms impacting your area, and it's all things that you're going to want to pay attention to, and something El Nino generally favors as well. So that's what we have for you guys, at least from an El Nino context of what's going on this winter. Next week, I'm actually going to be uploading a preliminary winter weather forecast based on new model runs, based on some more analysis, and based on how things have been progressing going forward. at least in terms of observations and in terms of how this El Nino is going to progress. We kind of covered a little bit of that, but I'm going to go a lot more in depth next week, so be sure you stay tuned for that. And be sure you like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. The goal, as always, is to get more people engaged with weather. Feel free to join the Storms United Discord server. The link to that is in the end screen. And with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. Stay safe.